Well, we had a really interesting flight here in the new S20 Raven from RANS. Now, just to put this in perspective here, this is basically two airplanes melded into one. This is the S6, which is their side-by-side tube and gusset and fabric covered airplane that they've made so many of. I don't know, thousands of those airplanes, I think. The company, by the way, has done, I believe, about 5,000 airplanes out there. So this is one of our most successful companies in the light aircraft space. Done a fine job for a long time. But the other airplane that this combines is the S7 Courier, which is a tandem-seated airplane, and turned out, although I didn't fly it early in the effort to fly many of the RANS airplanes, when I finally did fly it, I went, oh, I understand why people find it so magical. This is a really nice flying airplane, the S7 Courier. So now the company, and led by Randy Schlitter, the head designer and the owner of the company, took those two airplanes and kind of melded them together. The airplane, the S20 Raven, has the wings of the Courier and basically the fuselage of the S6. Now, it's not identical. They did do some changes in how the fuselage part is shaped, but the wings are essentially the same thing as on the S7 Courier. The instrument panel and a lot of the interior and firewall forward is essentially the S6 airplane that they've made so many of. There's a variety of the S6 airplanes, so I'm sure they took essentially the best of those and put them together. What this results in is basically, this is an S7 Courier that has side-by-side seating, if you will. And I'm sitting on the big boy tires here that we've got. This makes this particular airplane kind of a bush airplane. Indeed, Randy chose to use the grass runway for takeoff and landings here because concrete wears tires pretty quickly, and these big boy tires have some big boy prices to go along with them. Not everybody's going to want that. It does slow the airplane down. He said, I believe the number he told me was 4 or 5 miles an hour that it takes off of the cruise speed of the airplane to have these big tires on it, but it gives you both cross-country capability. The airplane still cruised very nicely. As I recall the numbers, it was about 115 mile an hour cruise, so you know, better than 100 knots, and you're doing nicely getting around the country in it. But you can also act as though it was a bush airplane with these large tires on it. The airplane is equipped with the regular 912 Rotax, not the IS version. RANS has always been a big supporter of that engine. They find it very competitive, and the IS version with the fuel injection is a good bit of extra cost. And for some people, they say that the power is a little bit less actually with the 912 IS than with the 912. So they've stuck with the 912 in this engine, although, as we heard from another builder out here, the 912 IS Sport now, which bumps that power back up, in fact, a little higher, everyone seems to think. That'll probably be a very popular choice on the Bush version of the S20 Raven, kind of like the one we're looking at right here. Typical factory production here on this particular airplane. They've always done a very nice job. Their airplanes are very well finished, and they fly as good as they look. In flight, I think as Randy demonstrated a lot of things to me in the airplane, most of the time he was barely touching the joystick, and much like we found on another airplane out here, you need to use hardly any rudder pedals. My experience was you use the rudder pedals to initiate the turn and then get off of the rudder pedals, because otherwise you're going to end up either slipping or skidding more than you need to. So you don't have to work very hard to fly this airplane. Also, on coming in for landing, Randy again demonstrated how easy it is to land by getting everything set up just right with the trim and the power settings and so forth, and then the airplane will almost land itself. And mind you, this is a tail dragger, so that's saying something more. Now, it didn't do exactly that. Of course, you still have to fly the airplane and use the controls properly, but you don't have to use them heavily because it's a very cooperative airplane. The combination of wings and the shape of the fuselage to the tail construction and the shape that they've used makes this a very well balanced airplane that does not need heavy use of the controls in any particular way or direction. And at very slow speeds, where there is both a round analog airspeed indicator in here in addition to the digital instruments, and you almost needed to look at the round one, because when the airspeeds got down, they got down so low that the numbers disappeared off the electronic instruments, as we found in some other airplanes. But the airplane at that still had good control motion. And the stall characteristics at that point always very straightforward, unless you had the rudder pedals too hard. We're using them too hard, which I did on one occasion, unnecessary, but you learn that quickly, that basically don't do too much with the rudder pedals, and in a stall, it's almost going to fly itself out of the stall. It's a nice characteristic. Let's go back to takeoff for a minute, though. Randy uses a very interesting technique that I can't recall from other airplanes, and I found it fascinating. You don't have to do this, by the way, and I would not do this until I was quite comfortable with the airplane. He's obviously quite at one with his own design. But his technique was full power. We accelerate it down the runway. Of course, in a tail dragger, you lift the tail up, and that gives you the ability to accelerate better and increases your aerodynamic control by your rudder pedals. But then at just about the right moment, I believe the number was 35 miles an hour, when it got to that speed, he would pull full flaps on. They hadn't been on at all at that point, and he would pull full flaps on, keeping his hand on the flap control lever, which is right between you, very convenient, 4 settings up to 40 degrees. So he would pull 40 degrees on, holding the detent button down, and the flaps pull off, and we'd jump off the ground, and then he'd slowly release the flaps as we continued our climb out. You could see from this effect, and this is off a grass runway where acceleration is a little slower than on a hard surface runway, the airplane jumped off the ground very quickly. So instead of using slats and other devices on the wing which add complexity, which add weight, which add cost, he just uses a little more wing volume to make this thing that is more wing area, to make this a Bush-like airplane. I don't know if you'd consider it a full Bush airplane, but it can do a lot of that duty while still keeping a simpler design, an easier build. But this is one you can also have either as a kit, as an SLSA, or therefore as an ELSA. So they can sell it to you kind of any way you want. They've got a lot of support out there for home builders, and that's a way to keep the cost down for those that are concerned about that. But RANS airplanes have always had pretty modest pricing on them too. They're pretty affordable airplanes. One reason why they've sold so many. So let's go back inside the airplane for a minute. This is a side-by-side seating, of course. That's sort of the whole concept of this airplane. The S7 Courier tandem turned into a side-by-side. In the airplane, it had one interesting feature which I don't recall seeing on any other airplane that I can think of. The seats adjust fore and aft, and as we did in an earlier video when this airplane was first introduced at Sebring earlier this year, at the beginning of this year, in fact, we saw some things about how the seats can lay all the way down, and you could sleep in the airplane if you wanted to. But when you want to adjust the seats fore and aft, which they do over a large range, as I recall, it's maybe 8 inches or so of movement, so it'll accommodate a lot of different heights of people. The seat, you lean forward a little bit and pull the seat towards you, and that is what releases the mechanism so you can slide it forward and aft. Therefore, you don't have to reach down between your legs and try and find a knob or on the side or whatever it might be. On many airplanes, it's different configurations for everyone. This made it's not intuitive right away because most don't use that, but once you get it, boy, it moved very easily in flight, no problem changing it. So you can vary that in any time you want. But one of the things that really stands out in my mind is the glorious visibility. It's tremendous. And one of the ways that I liked it so much was the skylight overhead. Now, it's a wide cabin. I don't know the inch width of it, but it's quite a wide cabin. And the whole top of the fuselage is plexiglass and gives just awesome visibility out the top. In any kind of a bank, because the cabin is wide, you can see right over the top of the wing. This is a high wing airplane. You can see over the top of the wing easily in almost any degree of bank, and certainly in a generous degree of bank. It's like a picture window looking out of the airplane. Really like that. For me, flying is a matter of being up in the air, being able to look at all the things down on the ground and enjoy where I am, and this airplane allows that in spades. Randy made an interesting comment, I thought. He said a lot of people down here living on their farm or whatever, we flew over some farmlands near the Midwest LSA Expo here. He says probably a lot of these people have never seen their countryside around them, and that's one of the wonderful things about flying, and this airplane lets you do it really well. Dual joysticks, typical RANS construction there, very comfortable and easy to use, very light controls without being touchy. Just a center throttle, single throttle in the middle, but very easy. This particular airplane was installed with mostly analog instruments and the Garmin Era, which is the small, removable, you can use it in your car too. It's a very nice instrument. I've always loved the Era, and it was one of the very first touch screens that came out. It's small, but it tells you all the stuff you need on it, and for an airplane like this, it's more than enough information to fly all around the country. And when you get to where you're going, you can pull that thing out and set it in your car, and it does has duty for car work too, so it'll drive you around town, show you all the points of interest. So pretty nice features to that. So stalling the airplane, it gets down slow. The numbers, and this had an analog airspeed indicator. One of the values of analog over digital, I love digital, but analog has its place, and one of its places is in airspeed, because when a digital gets down too low, the numbers just go away. They're not really terribly reliable at that speed anyway, because of the angle of the air going into the pitot tube, but an analog instrument in some ways is better that way. So at stall, Randy says you can make an approach at in the 40s coming in, or if that's 2 people aboard and relatively heavy. We were full fuel for our flight all the way to the top, so that added some extra weight to it. But if you're coming in solo, down to 35 miles an hour on approach, and that's a really slow stall speed. That's going to get you into a short field easily, and especially with a good combination of use of flaps, you can really make a kind of a bush airplane out of this. To get those numbers we're using, there are 4 notches of flaps, and the final notch of flaps is 40 degrees down. So they really come down far, and yet they have some pitching over motion when those numbers come down, when those flaps come down, which is typical, but it's not that distinctive. So we did stalls in flight, and they're very, very slow and very cooperative, very straightforward. The plane basically tries to fly itself out of a stall. You'd have to aggravate it by inappropriate use of the rudder pedals, and then you could do something that you shouldn't be doing. But otherwise, very cooperative characteristics to the airplane. So in flight, here's a couple of numbers just to give you some perspective on it. At the high cruise, 5,500 RPM, this is with the Rotax engine, of course. 5,500 RPM is going to give you about 115 miles an hour. That's a little over 100 knots, or right at 100 knots. At a lot of people, that's where Randy likes to cruise at, and Rotax will tell you, and he'll tell you, you can fly all day long at that power setting, so no issue. You're going to burn a little more fuel than you would if you back it off to about 5,000, where Randy says a lot of his customers like to fly. And at that speed, you're going to see about 100 miles an hour. So we're in 2014 doing this. Folks, remember, these videos are out there for a long time. Check with the factory for any recent changes to make sure you have the latest and best information. But basically in 2014, the airplane, we saw it the first time we saw it was down at Sebring. In the short space of time till here in September, the airplane went on the market, and about 20 of them in June, and about 20 of them are already out there in customers' hands. This is the only one flying at present, but we'll see some completions pretty soon. So that's a pretty good performance in a very short amount of time. And I hope we've given you plenty of information about the S20 Raven, this nice little airplane. I think is going to be a very popular one for the company, but they've got quite a wide range of airplanes and different configurations, and you want to get more information. Plus, they got some great bicycles. I happen to ride a RANS bicycle, a recumbent, and I love it. My wife has one as well, and they do quite well with bicycles as well as airplanes. So a very interesting company. Find more about all of that at RANS.com. Find more about it, the RANS airplanes and all kinds of other airplanes on my website, bydanjohnson.com or bydanjohnson.com.